There we go. Great. Well, I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I haven't read much Simone Weil, and so this was a real treat to hear her perspective on our obligations, human obligations, and her framing of what we usually call human rights, and the way she grounds that in the sacredness of the human heart and our connection to the good, I found quite moving and I believe correct.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I've been moved a lot by reading her. I cannot, I mean, it's many years since I've read somebody who actually touched me so much in my heart and inspired me also to think about self-transformation, how I can enter into this process or intensify this process of transformation of the way that I look at the world. She's been really inspiring in that respect, and I've had a lot of time to read her the last few months. So I've read a number of different things. But maybe I should just I don't know if you want to say something, Pedro, before I. Yeah. I mean, similarly, I've been reading her more. I even have incorporated her into my syllabus when I teach ethics. I tend to pair her with Iris Murdoch because Iris Murdoch, my students tend to really enjoy Simone Weil's ideas, although they're skeptical of her theological bent. And so, one good thing about pairing her with Iris Murdoch is Iris Murdoch is her ethics is so informed by Simone Weil, but she is an atheist. Qualify that. Um, Iris Murdoch was a Platonist, and I guess thought of the good as being a real transcendent source of the real transcendent source of morality towards which we aim at, but she didn't believe in a personal God or anything like that. And so I tend to pair Murdoch with Vey, to give students, you don't have to be a Christian like Vey to believe in her ideas and see the value of what she's saying, especially for human rights. I find that it really helps students understand why they think human rights are so important, even though they can't really provide a justification for it in the language that they're taught at school. And I think Simone Weil is really good for that. And also, just not in terms of teaching, but also for me, in terms of my spiritual practice, Weil is I, I I read here. I have a little altar here next to my desk, and I have Gravity and Grace. I read it at least. I read a paragraph every morning before I meditate and meditate on whatever I read that she wrote. So just for me personally, I don't think there's anybody besides maybe Thich Nhat Hanh who's had a more profound effect on my spiritual practice.
hmm.
Mm, yeah.
I
Yeah.
have Gravity and Grace as well, and also like to read just a few pages. It's a good book for reading just 2 or 3 pages before you go to bed.
Yeah.
So I enjoy that. I think one of the things that's interesting about her is that very often when she's introduced, the introduction to Vase is typically very biographical. I think it's because she's one of those philosophers where there's a real tight connection between her thinking and her mode of being in the world, where she had this huge drive to engage herself in the world, in the affairs of the world, and become involved. And there is stories about how in childhood she wouldn't eat sugar because during World War One, the soldiers they didn't have sugar. She became involved in Marxism and syndicalism. She had debates with Trotsky. Um, she was, although she was educated on the most prestigious French educational institute, it's called, I think, École Normale Supérieure. She was top of the class, um, ahead of Simone de Beauvoir in her year, and but still she went working on a factory for a couple of years. And that was one of the criticisms she had of Marxism was that Marx didn't really understand what it was like to be a worker, and she thought that um, modern day work practices are much more devastating for the human being that Marx were able to see. It was not just about distribution of wealth and different classes, but something spiritual was going on when you're subjected to these modern day world work practices. And she experienced that firsthand by going to work on a factory. She, I mean, she was in the Spanish Civil War for just a brief while. Luckily, because I mean, she couldn't see very well and stepped into a pot of boiling oil and had to be brought home. But the brigades that she was a part of, she I don't think she was fighting. I think she was volunteering, perhaps as a nurse or something like that, because she was a pacifist. She didn't believe in war, but she wanted to be involved. She wanted to be where the things were happening, and yeah, just after she was taken out of the Spanish Civil War, the brigade she was a part of it was actually eliminated, all of them. She also, during World War II, she wrote pamphlets, anti-Nazi pamphlets, eventually fled because she was born as a Jew and ended up as part of the Free French in London, where she worked as an analyst. And the text that we've been reading today was one that she wrote while she was working as an analyst for the Free French. And it was related to a larger work called The Need for Roots. And I think, Pedro, you read a part of The Need for Roots as well, the first 34 pages or so, which is some kind of ontology of needs that she felt was necessary to understand how, you could say, to understand the tailors of politics. And so I just want to briefly touch upon some basic ideas that she brings into her analysis of politics and her political philosophy. So she's a Platonist, and she has this very sharp contrast between what she calls the world of necessity and this divine realm of absolute goodness that she understands negatively as something that's beyond, say, normal human grasp. That there are ways to approach this realm of absolute goodness, um, but it takes some spiritual praxis to get there. So when you look at the texts she's writing, some of them are dealing with worldly affairs and what you'd call the world of necessity, the world of power, or the world of force. And some of them are these theological texts, mainly the letters she wrote to a Catholic priest that she befriended in the latter part of her life. And then there are some texts that are dealing with that are mainly dealing with or are focusing on what could be called intermediaries. And the Greek concept is metaxou, that which is in between. So these are the different kinds of practices that can bring us from the world of necessity, the world of force, and allow us to approach the divine realm of absolute goodness. And some of the things that she's thinking about is, I mean, she's thinking about beauty, for example. That's a Platonic thing, you could say. Beauty as something that is bridging the gap between the world of necessity and the divine realm of absolute goodness, but also labor. So there are, for example, she's talking about how physical labor, if you look at the materials and the processes you're involved with and see them as symbols of a higher order, that's kind of a Pythagorean trend in her thinking, that there is this harmony in the universe that do not see immediately, but if you kind of attend to the process and the materials you work with as symbols of this higher order, you can somehow. So one of the examples she gives is, for example, somebody working in the field sowing can contemplate the whole cycle of birth, death, and rebirth while doing the sowing, and in this way approach some kind of higher order. And the same goes for suffering. So she actually saw suffering as something that can also kind of uh, become a bridge to the divine. Um, this world of necessity she sees mainly as a world of force. So there are all these impersonal forces that human beings are subject to that kind of dehumanizes human beings, make them into things. And this is, for example, what is happening with modern day world practices, where you have this differentiation or distinction between planning and implementation. So those who do the implementation are not necessarily those who plan how to do it, and being in and also the automation, the mechanization of work and so on. All these things, they dehumanize the individual, make the individual into a passive thing, an object. And the subjective side of that is something she calls affliction. And the French term is malheur, which means something like unhappiness, accident is some of the connotations. Um, and it's translated as affliction. So it's something more than suffering. It's a kind of it's being exposed to a very brutal force that dehumanizes you and destroy you. Both physically, it has an effect. It wears you out, and but also psychologically and socially, it's a kind of destructive force that you can be subjected to as a human being in different ways. And it can happen through the forces of nature, through war, for example, but also through some of the dehumanizing modern practices that are very common. And so the subjective side of being exposed to these forces is what she calls affliction. But she sees in that an opportunity. Um, this is linked to the classical Christian term of kenosis, self-emptying, that this destruction that you're actually exposed to can be turned into an opportunity where the void that is actually created when you're destroyed as a person uh, can become an access point for the divine realm and the experience of what she calls grace. So the kind of the basics of her philosophy is this sharp contrast between the world of necessity, the divine realm of absolute goodness beyond human grasp, normal human grasp, and then this kind of bridging, mediating sphere where through certain kinds of spiritual practice, mainly what she calls attention, which is something we'll have to go back to. Attention is ultimately prayer. This is how she sees it. And this is what is kind of at the heart of all these different, say, intermediaries that can bring you into contact with this divine realm of absolute goodness. Um, yeah, that was just to maybe I was a bit confused because there's a lot there's a lot to say about her, but it's just to kind of outline some of the basics of her philosophy.
I wonder if
if you, Karsten or Pedro, you could say a bit about what led to her conversion and what her conversion experience was that led her sort of, if not away from some of the ideals of Marxism, at least she seemed to grow dissatisfied with uh, politics as a basis for moral action and became Christian at some point. Can do either of you know what transpired to lead to that shift?
I know that at least in terms of her conversion to Christianity, she had a set of mystical experiences that converted her to Christianity. I think she mentioned three or four of them. Um, the one that comes to mind for me that I know a little more details of is when she went to pray at the Church of Saint Francis of Assisi or a place where Saint Francis of Assisi had inhabited in Italy, and she had a claims to have had a mystical experience there where she saw Christ and um, trying to remember any other details. I don't want to say something that she didn't say, but it was a series of mystical experiences that converted her to Christianity. And prior to that, she was kind of skeptical about religion. I know also that she's deeply studied Eastern philosophies, learned Sanskrit to read the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads. New Buddhism, new Taoism. She talks about these things, and I think she mentioned somewhere, and something that I very much resonate with myself, that in some sense, studying these Eastern religions and philosophies actually helped her appreciate Christianity more. But like Karsten said, she grew up in a Jewish family, but I think they were pretty agnostic. Um, as a family, and so I think it required those mystical experiences for her to have this full-blown conversion to Christianity. And in terms of like her political commitments, I think that I don't know too many details about her moving away from Marxism, although she did kind of, I think, disavow it. But like Karsten already alluded to, she thought that to solve a lot of the political turmoil and trouble of her time required a return to, or required a inner spiritual transformation. And so I think I'm reading a book right now that's super interesting, comparing Georges Bataille and Simone Weil, two very, very different people, but they knew each other. They in the 40s in France and interacted, and um, they were both participated, I think, in a particular journal that was, among other things, anti-fascist. And one of the arguments of this book, it compares the politics of Bataille and Weil and how it's grounded in their mysticism, is that she's kind of sought to make her life almost like a sacred text as an example for people to follow. Um, and so, yeah, I think Karsten is very right to point out that, she wanted to lead by example to make her life the example for others to follow. And it seems like she had tried many times, either through the Spanish Civil War when she wanted to be sent to the front lines in World War II. I think she might have wanted a martyr's death, to die in the front lines. That's not what happened. She ended up passing away from tuberculosis in England and refused to eat more than the rations that the French soldiers got in France. And it's debated whether you can consider that her starving herself or not. Um, People seem to have different opinions on that. I think the coroner, the person who um, gave the autopsy, um, considered it a suicide. Some people don't consider it a suicide because she already had tuberculosis, but she did refuse to eat more than the rations of the soldiers in France, and that did seem to contribute to her death. But anyway, I, that's what I know about the relationship between her commitments to the sacred and how that informs her politics.
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah, interesting that she had that experience in Assisi. I visited there, and that basilica is one of the few where I felt a real, I find cathedrals and churches, many of them quite beautiful, but walking into that one in particular left me with a real sense of the presence of the divine. And I don't know if that's because of Saint Francis's purity or what, but it's interesting that that was where she had that first important mystical experience that led to her conversion.
Yeah,
I
and
think
I should
actually,
say I don't know if it was the first, and I don't know if it's like the basilica that you're talking about, or just one of them. Those are
Huh.
details I need. Those are details that I don't specifically remember, but it was definitely one that Saint Francis of Assisi had either built or like actively been
Hmm.
in. And so just, I definitely fact check me on those things, but those are the details that I can claim that I read.
Do you want to add something, Karsten?
yeah, I just first of all, she had a few experiences, and the first she had was actually reading some English poem. I have it somewhere, and reading this poem out loud for herself, she suddenly realized that it was a prayer, and realizing that she had some kind of, say, profound spiritual experience. So that was before her encounter with the Christ. That's something that happened later on. But also, I think it's important to say that I don't think there's such a thing as a sudden dramatic conversion in her life. And I don't think she saw it like that herself. I think she saw some kind of continuity in the kind of ideas she had before, and that just came up into a kind of blossoming once she embraced, you could say, the Christian narrative and some of the Christian mystics as well. So, for example, Meister Eckhart was on her reading list in her notebook, so she read some of the Neoplatonic mystics. But she also had this view that she actually saw Plato, and that's very disputed sometimes, but she saw Plato as some kind of proto-Christian. So she saw a continuity between, in particular, the Pythagorean trend in Plato's philosophy, and she, I mean, without approaching it with any kind of historical critical method, she had this kind of idea that there was some kind of wisdom tradition going from ancient Egypt through the Pythagoreans into Greek philosophy and onward into Neoplatonism and the Christian church fathers and Christianity as a whole, and also uh, her views on Judaism is kind of, say, provocative for some because she really disliked a lot of the things in the Old Testament because she saw it just as a power games, a description of a multitude of power games. She liked some of the prophetic literature, and she also had this, again, not based on any kind of historical critical method, but she had this idea that this Pythagorean mode of thinking also somehow entered into the prophetic literature of things like Job's book and Isaiah's book, for example, were some of the parts of the Old Testament that she viewed very positively. So, and when it comes to Marxism, I mean, I think she was inspired by Marx her whole life, but it was the younger Marx, and so some of his, I mean, his analysis of alienation and so on that he somehow adapted from Hegel, I think she had a very positive view on. It's more like his once Marxism became an ideology, she became very that part she was very critical of, and so she sees. I mean, one of the texts that I'm reading is I think it's called this war is a war of religions, it's called. And so she saw modern ideologies like Marxism, communism, fascism, liberalism as different religions, uh, having fighting it out, so to speak. And the reason, so in her activism, she was part of what is called the syndicalist movement in France. And the reason why she became disillusioned with that was because she saw it as power games again, people playing power games, and she just felt that there was so much more that was needed than just having this fight over how to distribute wealth. So very often unions and so on, they will fight for higher wages for the workers. But basically she saw that as selling your soul to the devil for more money because of these destructive, soul destroying forces that are kind of inherent in modern work practices. So I just want to say that I think there's kind of continuity. That there's a flowering of some insights that she originally had reading Plato, and also she learned herself Sanskrit, as Pedro told, to read the Bhagavad Gita and was inspired by that as well. So, for example, I guess something like her concept of decreation that we can go back to seems like something that comes from this Eastern concept of detachment somehow, detaching yourself from worldly affairs and personhood. Um, yeah, so I think there was a continuity, and then she saw her kind of mystical experiences and her this embracing Christian ideas as a blossoming of something that was already there from the beginning.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think maybe that's nice background on who she was and her life. Maybe we can dig into this, what she calls a draft for a statement of human obligation. I've read through it twice now, and I found it so clear and quite moving. When I first read, the first few propositions, which I'll just share some snippets of, I couldn't help but feel like she was approaching this from a Kantian point of view, but where Kant would separate theoretical from practical reason, and we can't have knowledge of the supersensory world in a theoretical sense, but we can, in our practical or moral experience, Kant would allow for some type of connection to what he called the moral law. And Kant would describe a feeling of reverence for that law that every human being has. And I gradually realized that Weil was really affirming the sacredness of the good, and that this good is experienced through the human heart. And while Kant, uh, recognized the dignity and moral worth of human beings coming through um, our experience of the good, it seems like Kant was mediating that through the will, through the um, subjective will in a way, or the autonomous will. And maybe Weil was a little bit more skeptical of the extent to which uh, the human will could really reliably access and uphold that capital G good. But when she says there is a reality outside the world, outside space and time, outside man's mental universe, outside any sphere whatsoever that is accessible to human faculties, that immediately sounds very Kantian to me. Um, but then she says that corresponding to this reality at the center of the human heart is the longing for an absolute good, which is always there and is never appeased by any object in this world. And then an even more Kantian point, she says, one of the manifestations of this reality lies in the absurd and insoluble contradictions, which are always the terminus of human thought when it moves exclusively in this world. So I thought of Kant's antinomies of human reason when we try to think our way to the origins of the world or the nature of space and so on, we end up in contradictions. So I think just to throw something in the mix here from Goethe, which leads into a kind of anthroposophical view on this question. There's, if like I was saying in Kant, he doesn't allow for a theoretical um, understanding of the ultimate nature of reality. We're limited to phenomena as constructed by our intuitions of space and time and our categories of understanding. But in Kant would say in our awareness of the moral law, and that feeling of respect I mentioned for that law, there's some kind of it's not an empirical feeling, it's a some kind of non-empirical or trans-empirical affect um, that discloses our own freedom to us. And to the extent that we recognize that in ourselves, we can recognize it in others. And for Kant, that respect for freedom forms the basis of what we would call human rights. Um, Simone Weil values freedom, and she has some propositions about that later, but it's not, there's something beyond even that, the good, that she's gesturing towards. But it's in Kant, there is some degree of participation in a super sensible world through our feeling of reverence for the moral law and our sense of conscience, right? And when Goethe was reading Kant's Critique of Practical Reason and other writings on morality, he asks, why Kant's demand that we uh, rise above the finite understanding and our sensory intuitions of space and time in the moral sphere can't also apply to our aesthetic and imaginative and theoretical relationship to the natural world. So Goethe didn't think that we were limited in the way that Kant did. And it seems Weil does as well. That there's, even though uh, we contact something infinite, transcendent in our hearts, it's beyond our capacity to fathom. Whereas Goethe would say, Goethe asks Kant basically if in our ethical action, we're drawing on ideas that outstrip our sense-bound sort of mechanical understanding, then why can't we, through a kind of intuition of what he calls eternally creative nature, become worthy of participating spiritually in its creative processes? So Goethe thinks there's this deeper intuitive understanding of living form that's kind of a cognitive or theoretical analogy to moral faith. And when thinking about what Goethe is claiming there, from a from Simone Weil's point of view, as I understand it, I immediately feel like, oh, she would think that's hubris. Um, that's some kind of conceit that might be taking our attention away from the real task, which is not to know everything, but to bring goodness down from heaven, as it were, into earthly relationships. That's what she felt was of most importance in human life, rather than uh, what Goethe would call intuitive understanding of, processes of metamorphosis in nature. Interesting as that may be, maybe she would say that's a distraction, pulling our attention away from the moral task, which has preeminence. Um,
I think like she was, I'm trying to get a book on this, but I think she was kind of inspired by the Pythagoreans in this point, in that her brother was a very well-known mathematician, and she was also very well versed in the sciences, and math.
hmm,
And she has a book that's kind of hard to find on, I think on math and science. It's something like relating like math, science, and love. But she,
hmm,
towards the end of her life, I did read that she was studying also physics more intensely and mathematics. But she saw it all, like to your point, like I don't think dismissed it, but all of it should provide a greater reverence and deepening our relationship to the divine. Um, and so she saw, I think also math and science as opportunities for seeing the order of the universe, and we revere the order of the universe because we gra intuitively grasp the beauty that's there. And and that beauty is the way Iris Murdoch puts it, that I love it, is that beauty is the visible aspect of the good, and she gets that from they, I think, and her Platonism. And so I don't think she would completely dismiss Goethe, but if it's just for the sake of understanding and doesn't deepen our participation in the divine or transform us morally, then it's in vain.
But I mean, just to add to Goethe's point of view, I think he would also say that um, it's only through a loving attention to nature
Right.
that these deeper forms, not visible to our physical senses, reveal themselves. And so
Mhm.
I think there's something in that that suggests that we have to go through the good to get to the true. Um, right. So maybe they're not as incompatible as it was first seeming to me, because it just felt like initially Vey was uh, declaring that human cognition is limited and that we
Mhm.
shouldn't try to understand what our heart reveals to us about this transcendent world, which will always remain incomprehensible to us, but we still, all we know about it is that we should revere it. um,
I'm not sure she's saying that I mean, it's incomprehensible in terms of normal human faculties,
uh,
but also I think it's on her side, it's more of a Platonist point of view than Kantian,
sure.
although some would
Yeah.
also say that Kant is actually writing in the Platonic dialect somehow. But I think more of I mean, if you think of book 6 and 7 in the Republic, that is treating this concept of goodness and end in some kind of aporia in terms of saying what this goodness actually is.
Yeah. It can't be
And
defined.
yeah, so I think it's more like it's there she has the inspiration. So I think when I read this, I was thinking about Keiji Nishitani and his concept of absolute nothingness, where he has this, it's a kind of a dialectic that when we think of nothing, we think of it as relative to being. And that's, in his view, a kind of impoverished view of what nothingness is. So there's this absolute nothingness that goes beyond, and this it's not nothing and it's not being either, but it's more something like the source of being and nothing in the, say, relative domain that lend itself to conceptualization. And
Mm.
also Nishitani, he has this, I mean, he's just uses, he's talking about some kind of existential turn where the self, once you approach this, say, field of absolute nothingness, at a certain point, the self becomes is at stake, you could say, um, and so the self, it's like coming close to some kind of black hole. The self is kind of absorbed into this field of absolute nothingness, and that happens in a process that he calls the great doubts. That's a term he has from his Buddhist background. And then, inspired by Nietzsche, he's talking about this turn, and perhaps Heidegger as well, but he's talking about this turn that he then calls the great affirmation or the great reaffirmation, where the world of samsara, the world of relative things, is kind of reaffirmed once you've entered into this field of absolute nothingness and experience your oneness perhaps with it. You can kind of turn your attention to the what's it called, samsara, the illusory world in the Buddhist tradition, but it's seen as being rooted in this field of absolute nothingness, and thus acquire some kind of ontological status that it didn't have before. And I think in Wei's thinking, so I think of Wei as an existentialist in a sense. I know Albert Camus was one of the greatest admirers uh, before I can't remember how it is. I think he,
I mean,
uh,
the greatest souls of our generation.
yeah, something like that. Yeah. So that was one thing I would say that I think this aporia in terms of what absolute goodness actually is, it comes from Plato
Hmm.
and the Neoplatonic tradition, her reading of Meister Eckhart and so on. And so I just want to comment also what Pedro was saying about her views on science and math and so on. So I think, first of all, I read an article she wrote about quantum physics. And what I understood from that is that she has a criticism of modern science that is actually very much like the Whitehead's and Bergson's criticism of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So she saw this very clearly that there's this tendency to um, see our models as reality or confusing our models with reality. And that also touches upon another thing relating to Goethe, because to have this kind of existential turn, you need to allow for what she calls the void. There needs to be some kind of void where grace can pour in, so to speak. And so she was suspicious of certain uses of imagination when imagination is used to fill that void and in a sense block you off from the possibility of grace pouring into your life. So that would be her suspicion of imagination in that respect.
Hmm.
That reminds me of something. One thing that you wrote once, Matt, that really stuck with me is that the soul is built out of what it believes to be true, I think is you wrote something along those lines. And I'd never heard anybody put it like that. And it just immediately struck me as that's right. And that's actually very important. And so relating to what Karsten is saying, when you take these models for reality, um, I think it's a kind of force in extending her idea of force is that which dehumanizes us. Obviously, when she writes in the Iliad or the poem of Force, she writes how the Iliad talks about dehumanizing force. Obviously the person that suffers violence is dehumanized, turned into a thing. The aggressor is also dehumanized, and we can talk about that more too. I think that's a more profound point that people don't talk about is that committing violence also dehumanizes you. But I think connecting to what you said once, Matt, that the soul is made out of what it believes in, right? That's the problem with, taking, for example, physicalist models as what you are, right? There's something also dehumanizing about that in that it misses, um, I guess it misses the moral aspects of our existence, as they would consider it the higher part of the soul as opposed to the lower carnal parts of the soul, as I think the language that she would use. So I think there is something dehumanizing there, combining what you said with the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. There's an argument to be made as how that's a form of dehumanizing force on a subjective
Mm.
level. Um, yeah, so I wanted to add that to what Karsten said. And there was one thing that wasn't the initial thing that I had to say, but maybe it'll come back to me in a second.
Mm.
Oh, sorry. It's the mystical experience part. Sorry. I think this is where the mystical experience is really important for they, but also for, I guess, grasping this is that, when you read the allegory of the cave for the first time, you're like, okay, Plato, I guess this is a metaphor for enlightenment, right? When I know something, I'm smarter, whatever. But I think it's almost like the mystical experience is the crown jewel finally that maybe establishes the continuity of everything that she learned. Um, you have these Eastern philosophies and you have Platonism, and they all seem to point towards this idea of nothingness or something beyond being, as Plato would put it. That's kind of hard to grasp when you're just reading it. And that's because you try to conceptualize these things as an object of knowledge, when I think what it's all pointing at is that um, at the end, outside of the cave, or these experiences of nothingness, it's a non-conceptual form of knowledge because conceptual knowledge relies on that subject-object distinction. But at that level of what they're trying to talk about, it can only be known as subject, right? And so I thought about this yesterday. It kind of hit me and it's so simple, but I never really thought about it this way, is that, like, for example, if you want to think about goodness or God, um, they can't be known as an object. Any conceptual knowledge that I have of these things isn't the real thing. God, for example, could only, I think this is Martin Buber's argument, could only be known as subject. So what does it mean to know God or goodness as subject? It means to become that thing. Right. And so it can only be experienced through yourself, such that there's a coincidence of the subject. But so, and that's a different form of knowing. And so that's why I think the mystical experience is so important for Vey. Hopefully that makes sense. I think for me, that was a very clarifying thing to think, oh, goodness or God can only be known as subject, and therefore is a completely different order of knowledge.
Do you think it's subject so much as maybe something more like second through the second person grammatically? So I think of like Martin Buber's I and thou is ik and du. I and you really would be a more sort of colloquial translation. So you as in um yeah, referring to another subject, but in a mode of communion with that subject, so that it's kind of like the divine or the good can only be known relationally, intersubjectively, maybe, or intra-subjectively, like in the space between subjects,
I like intra. Yeah, I think intersubjective still presupposes,
two
my
subjects.
like the empirical world, and intrasubjective implies maybe a communion, like you said, of a subjectivity that coincides with you, but still feels other in some sense, which is characteristic of a mystical experience.
Yeah, because subject to me connotes private, and it seems to me that the nature of the divine in our, to the extent that we have any experience of that mystically or morally, it's neither, it can't be sequestered into the privacy of interiority, but nor can it be just thought of as public, because obviously many people don't experience God at all, so but it's sort of in between, um in that space of relation. And so when you have mystical experience, at least in my experience and the reports of many of the mystics from Eckhart to Wey, it seems as though there's an identification with the divine, the kind of theosis is occurring, but there's still a distinction
Yeah.
between oneself and the divine. So it's not just a merger, it's relational, right?
Yeah, I think that's what William James talks about, that there's a sense of, I forget the exact terms that he uses, but of almost like being commanded, such that there's a coincidence, but it's not you calling the shots
Hmm.
in that sense. Something that's hard to describe.
Right. And then
Yeah.
what you're,
I think maybe here Plotinus he would say about the one, we can understand the one, but we can be the one. And so I
Yeah.
think this what is it's also about coming to understand that in a sense you are the universal subject and also experiencing somehow that this universal subject in a sense is all that there is. Um, I get all the dangers of thinking in this way. I see and hear all the red lights, but I think there's something about this thing about something you can only understand by being it.
Mhm. Yeah,
So it's a collapse, you could say, of intelligibility and being. They kind of fuse in that moment.
right. And just to circle back to the um, what you drew from something I wrote about the soul being composed of what it believes. I mean, just to unpack that a little bit, I think it's related to what Vey means by attention, and that we become what we attend to, or we become more like what we attend to. And that means like every thought, um, every feeling we indulge, every deed, whether deeds of love or deeds of hate, certainly those who are uh, inflicting violence on others are degrading the quality of their own soul. as much as they're degrading the souls of those that they're harming. And so it's a comment that I take to follow from, um, a process ontology. And it's, I think, related to also how the Romantic poets, like Keats in particular, relate to the nature of the soul. Keats has this great term, soul making, um, so that it's emphasizing the extent to which, while the soul may be eternal, it's also a living being, which is to say, it needs nourishment in order to grow. And if it isn't nourished, if it's malnourished, then it shrivels and becomes less powerful. And we, uh, depending on our mode of attention, the quality of our attention, our soul um, can uh, come more into its full potential, or it can um, wither away. And I think that speaks to the urgency of the human condition, that, our physical bodies and our living organism um, take us so far. And then there's a point where that natural growth stops and it becomes a matter of soul making. It becomes a matter of training our own attention, which is um, a moral question, really. And from that point forward, it's, the extent to which we can direct our attention towards love that determines the extent to which we continue to grow as human beings. And maybe to to the extent that we fail to develop that attention um, out of our own freedom, we don't even become fully human. I mean, maybe we can be Homo sapiens in the sense that a biologist would define our species without loving attention, but to really become human in the deeper spiritual sense that someone like Weil is talking about, um, it's up to us, each of us, as individuals. And so um, that's kind of what was behind that statement.
Yeah. I talk about this with my students when I'm trying. So I taught the poem of Force this semester um, to them, and they really seem to resonate with it in the sense that, like, I think at least most of my students, they have even though they come with certain precept, typically a kind of a disposition towards relativism or against moral realism, they're also very inclined to intuitively think that human rights are good or believe in something like the golden rule. And when, the idea of dehumanization makes sense to them. And so when I teach the poem of force, I also teach the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass talks about a part or an event that happened where he's given to a new slave owner. And the wife of that slave owner, Mrs. Auld, at first, she's the nicest white woman that he's ever met, the nicest owner he's ever had. She takes care of him. She starts teaching him how to read, and he's shocked. He's like, who is this lady? I thought all the slave owners were mean. But then her husband says, you can't teach a slave how to read. They'll become unfit to be a slave. You can't be too nice to them. You have to, impose yourself, be a slave owner. And after that, after receiving those orders from her husband, he said, she drank from the poison of irresponsible power, and she went from the sweetest angel to a demon. And I use that as an example to show students, like, it's a little less intuitive for them to think, well, how does violence dehumanize the aggressor? Well, here's an example, right? In Sophia Auld, she goes from being a good Christian woman taking care of this, she recognizes the humanity in Douglas, and then she receives these orders from her husband, and she completely transforms her behavior, becomes a monster, becomes violent, starts dehumanizing him. And in turn, he says, like, she's unrecognizable now because now she is lying to herself and believing the lie that Douglas is less human than she is. And that kind of really makes it click for the students. And to the point of what you said, they can see, she's still a person, but like she's more of a monster than a human now. And what does it really mean to be human is a hard question, but it has something to do, as Vey said, being sensitized. And the poem of Force, she basically says as much, that the greatest moments of humanity in the Iliad are when force is overcome by love, or especially the loving recognition between enemies. She points out the mutual respect of a scene that happens, I think, in Apollo's temple between Achilles and Priam. And she seems to point or argue that to be dehumanized, how the aggressor is dehumanized is that um, they become deaf and dumb, she says, both to reason. And we see this in so many Greek tragedies, like in Antigone with Creon not listening to reason, in Oedipus, these figures that they develop a tyrannical personality that becomes immune to reason, and then they suffer the consequences of force. But she also says it's not just being deaf and dumb to reason, but being deaf and dumb to human compassion and suffering. And so being one, incapable of reasoning, or less capable of using our reason freely, and two, being numb or desensitized to human suffering and compassion, all these things make us less than human in the sense you're talking about, I think.
Mhm.
Can I
Right.
connect this to this idea of absolute goodness? Because I think one question you could ask here is, well, how do you know whether a person is actually attending to absolute goodness? And here I think it's a case of knowing the tree by its fruits. So the way the Weil sees it is that what happens to you if you become attentive to this realm of absolute goodness is that you become attentive to all the basic needs that other beings have in the world of necessity. And this is where she has this kind of ontology of needs that she's making a list, and it's incomplete, and she says it can change over time, but she mentions in the text we read today, she mentions this list of needs of souls where she talks about freedom, obedience, equality, hierarchy, private and collective property, security, risk, responsibility, honor, punishment, rootedness, etc. And what she's doing in the first part of the need of roots is that she's analyzing these different needs in more detail. But I think it's important to say it. I mean, it changes over time, and it can be debated what the actually needs are. But she's talking about needs of the soul, so it's not just material needs. And she has there's another thing she says in that's in an um, it's a text called I think it's in this Are We Fighting for Justice? She's talking about what she called the madness of God, which is the madness of God is that God is in desperate need of consent from human beings. And she's talking about how those beings who are attentive to the realm of absolute goodness experience pain when something is happening to someone without their consent. So this idea of consent is very central for her, and it has to be a kind of informed consent because through means of propaganda and all different kinds of things, we can come into a situation where our consent is not an informed consent. We do not actually know what it is we're consenting to. So that's a very central part for I think for her that the telos of politics is addressing the needs of souls somehow. Those who should be in power should be those who are actually attentive to the actual needs that human beings have. And what she's opposing basically is political realism, where might is right, where you do what you can do simply because you can do it. Yeah. And so I
Right.
think she's very lucid here and very powerful in her way to phrase these things as a kind of counterpoint to political realism.
Right. Yeah, what you say about the divine uh, needing human consent. Um, she says that uh, the good is a power which is only real in this world insofar as it is exercised. And so the human being becomes, to the extent that we can direct our attention to the good, the channel through which or the bridge across which, the divine can pass into this world. It reminds me of something Whitehead says in his book Religion in the Making, that he says the power of God is the worship that God inspires. So, in other words, to the extent that human beings can um, orient themselves to the good, then that sacred power of goodness can operate in the world. But without human consent, it doesn't happen, right? And
No,
so it's a
it's not
much more
actualized.
participatory. It's not
Mm.
actualized. Um, but in terms of politics, I mean, the way you're describing that, obviously, it's very Platonic. I think of the Republic immediately, which on the surface is a dialogue about the ideal state, but it's really, I think, a dialogue about the well-ordered soul, with the implication being, I mean, one of the implications being, I think there's always multiple levels of interpretation going on in every dialogue, but one of the implications is that if you want a well-ordered state, you need to start with souls and think about this in terms of education. Um, and, you could read Plato as saying, just like there are different qualities of metals, there are different qualities of human beings, or you could read him as saying that every individual human being has these different levels, right? And we need to have a well-ordered state and a just society, cultivate the gold in us, which is the good, and use that to temper these other levels of our soul, um, our will and our feeling life and our sensory life, not because those are evil, but because if they run the show, um, we end up with a very destabilized social situation full of injustices and so on. Um, but I mean, this, to my mind, there's so many statements that I can't help but feel the urgency of their relevance to our moment. I mean, um, and the way in which, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, and it seemed like liberalism was ascendant and liberal capitalism, Fukuyama's End of History and all that. And, we're in a very different time now, a generation or so later, where liberalism seems like a failed project now, all of a sudden. And I think part of that failure is how hollow the basis for this idea of human rights is in a liberal uh, political philosophy, where it's no more than a shared agreement that's been institutionalized that would be the basis for this idea of human rights. In other words, human rights is only real to the extent that the UN can enforce that, which isn't very, there's not very much power in that institution. And so it makes the idea of human rights, from that liberal point of view, seem kind of flimsy and unrealistic. And so we default to this might makes right idea, which seems to be what's governing the um, new multipolar world order right now, where Russia will take control of its sphere of influence, and the U.S. will take control of its sphere of influence over in this hemisphere, and there's no higher sense of value to adjudicate human relationships. But for Simone Weil to just state this very simply, every human being without any exception is something sacred, which we are bound to show respect. And she says this is the only possible motive for universal respect towards all human beings. So there has to be a spiritual ground here, or we're lost. And I think there are so many well-meaning intellectuals who are fearful of religion for various reasons, um, that seem resistant to this. But I don't see another way forward. If you don't have that sense of the sacred that's beyond our comprehension, at least our secular understanding's comprehension, then we're just, how could we not default to might makes right and this more Darwinian survival of the fittest, social Darwinism sort of situation? Um, so
And
it
I,
really strikes me as that Vey has important lessons for us right now.
yeah, and I think as I hear you implying basically that it almost seems like this kind of democratic liberal project of, government being for the people, legitimacy deriving from the consent of the governed, right? And democratic participation requires this spiritual basis almost.
Mhm.
And it reminds me of something Hannah Arendt said that about the distinction between power and violence. That in I think this is in her book on violence. That in the history of Western political thought, power has been almost equated with whoever has power is the one that's capable of doing violence, which goes all the way back to Hobbes and the Leviathan. Um, and she has, whether or not this is informed by Weil, I don't know. I know she did read Simone Weil, but she wanted to flip that to say, well, actually, violence is weak in the sense that it always ultimately leads to its dissolution. And we see this seen this in totalitarian regimes is, it starts as something that you might consider very great and powerful, but ultimately the maintenance of power through violence, through usually a few people that increase their violent tentacles and sphere of influence through technologies and armies and manipulation, right? Eventually, the circle of trust gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually evil consumes itself. And to add to that, right, as Vabe points out, no real consent in being coerced, right? You're never going to get someone's consent if if you use violence to get them to do what you say. The first opportunity they get to defy you, they will. There's no real respect or consent in that. And so Hannah Arendt wants to argue that real power comes from consent, but it's fragile compared to violence uh, that uses terror to maintain itself. But I think that's what a, lib a liberal democracy requires, right? It requires consent or inspired consent, not just like any
Yeah.
sort of terror. But if there's no sort of spiritual foundation for that, like for example with human rights, right? I think this is where the part of the political importance of process philosophy comes in, is in pointing out all the ways in which our worldviews about science and consciousness and the mind shape the way we understand the human and what it means to be human can actually be detrimental to having that moral foundation required for
Yeah.
a democracy.
Right. And just to say about the fragility of democracy when there's only a secular set of values to draw upon in its support, we want to uphold this value of equality. But in what way are human beings equal? And, Vey raises this question, um, where, she says that there are certain people who attract our attention and our love in a unique way. Family members, romantic partners, friends. And it, because of that, there's a sense in which our own affections can't be equally distributed at the level of just our, everyday human faculties. Like we're limited to the extent that we can love people unless we have this deeper transcendent sense that she identifies with. This is the nature of the human being, that we have this longing for an absolute good. And it's
Mm.
that makes us equal, right? And it's beyond just our unequal affections for people at the level of our normal, sensibility, that calls for this transcendent good that by which we can then recognize and respect others, even strangers, but also a sense of equality, um, politically is different, and I think often gets conflated in secular liberal societies, especially among progressives, where we want equality to be something understood in terms of all capacities, which is obviously not true. We don't all have equal capacities. And because we don't have this transcendent source of what makes us all identical, where does she put it? She says, only by really directing the attention beyond the world can there be real contact with this central and essential fact of human nature. Only an attention thus directed possesses the faculty, always identical in all cases, of irradiating with light any human being whatsoever. So it's like equality is a spiritual a transcendent ideal, it's not something we perceive in the sensory world. And so if we're in a secular cultural context where we think, we only have access to our animal instincts and maybe some abstract rational ideals or whatever, we're never going to be able to perceive the basis of that equality by which a democratic society, could be organized. And so I think there's a real need for spiritual renewal at that level so that we can understand what this value that all people in the modern democratic West say they uphold, what it really means and what it doesn't mean. Because there's a leveling effect if you try to apply equality outside of the political domain to our cultural activities, whether in science or in art or in sports or, areas where it's obvious that we're not all equal, right? So, hmm,
Yeah, this is where this need of obedience comes in. Like if I'm in a if I'm witness to a traffic accident and somebody's hurt and the doctor's at the scene, we want to
right.
respect the capacities that he have and kind of step back in that situation. And there are so many situations in life where we're together with people who in this or that direction are more skilled than we are ourselves. And if we are loving creatures, we want to make space for them and allow them to do their thing. So and one thing I was thinking about when we look at the state of affairs in the world is Plato's analysis of how debasement of drives lead to this degradation in the kind of government forms you have. So in his view of aristocracy, that what is dominating is the desire for goodness, for truth, uh, and then in you have this other form. I can't remember what he calls it, where because it becomes love of honor instead, and then it becomes love of wealth in the oligarchy and in democracy. And I think we see that in our modern day world. It becomes, I mean, I don't know how Plato puts it, but it becomes consumption for the sake of consumption. It's
Love of pleasure,
everybody love for pleasure, yeah. Everybody
happiness, whatever.
just
Hmm.
doing their own thing. So you kind of see this debasement of drives moving towards tyranny, where there's this person who just wants it all for himself and maybe has some kind of powers to mislead people and so on, and you end up with tyranny and so the thing, I mean, Plato's not he's not anti-democratic, but he's anti-debasement of our drives. He wants our society to be governed by people who aspire to the highest truths and forms of goodness.
That's where I think the discussion exemplified between Thrasymachus and Socrates, and later I think he talks about it later in towards the end of the Republic, when I think Socrates says something along the lines of that there's actually a lot of similarity between the soul of the philosopher and the soul of the tyrant. The difference is where Eros is directed.
Mm.
In the tyrant, it's unbounded. In the philosopher, it's directed towards the good. Um, but I think this also it reminds me again. Often I have little debates in my head between Nietzsche and Socrates, or you say Nietzsche and Weil, which is why I got this book on Bataille and Weil, because it's really the question of, is there any sort of grounding to transcend towards, or is it just completely groundless? Um, and I think the image that we have of the liberal individual or ideal liberal individual as the ideal that our society seems to hold is that we want to have people that are free to pursue whatever projects they may have, insofar as it doesn't really interfere with the freedom of others, but we want to give, almost as much as we can unbounded freedom for people to be whoever they pursue whatever identity they want. And I think in one sense there's a lot of good things about that. But then it risks also, going back to Plato, missing the kind of moral education or moral direction needed to form a responsible populace that can handle having a democracy that doesn't devolve into any sort of um, any sort of, I guess, sloppy sort of rule. I know that Aristotle said, the ideal sort of ruling with one person is a monarchy, a degraded monarchy is a tyranny. You have the aristocracy, degraded aristocracy is a oligarchy. Then there's democracy, but there's no name for a degraded democracy. At least I don't think he gives one in the politics. Um, but to have that sort of informed citizenry, um, or a citizenry demos that's educated enough to sustain a good democracy requires some sort of moral grounding or foundation that I think Plato points to, but that in the idea of the liberal individual, there is no grounding, there is no direction. It's, do what you want as long as, you're not breaking laws or interfering with the freedom of others. And that I think having no sort of, ideal such as the good or even sort of a moral foundation for that, or how a populace should be educated is also harmful and leads to the degradation of democracy. And so I keep thinking of Nietzsche here, and that Nietzsche seems to be this great champion of, will to be yourself. It doesn't matter essentially what you will to be, as long as you aspire to some sort of ideal, great version of yourself, completely unbounded by any standard of goodness. Um, and there's nuances to how you read Nietzsche there, but that's how a lot of people receive Nietzsche. And I think that that kind of expresses that the liberal ideal that we have, and which is also maybe harmful to having a well functioning democracy. I don't know if that makes sense, but
It makes me think about what Wei's writing about education, which also she picks up. That's a Platonic thing as well, that she writes about education and the necessity of a certain kind of education. And for her, education is basically about the cultivation of attention. And she actually puts it like the best way to train your attention is to study things that you're not interested in. I mean, study math for the sake of math, but not necessarily out of any kind of love for math. She says that's actually better when it comes to training your attention. Of course, you have to dedicate yourself to the study, but you actually, in a sense, attention is best trained if you kind of overcome your own inclinations. And the ultimate form of attention, in her view, what all kinds of, say, practice or training of attention is a preparation for, is prayer. So prayer is the highest mode of attention in her view, but it's not perhaps prayer like we normally think about it. It's prayer as a kind of meditation, a waiting uh, um, um, for goodness, for grace to enter into your um, the void that is created through your kenosis, your self emptying when you're fully attentive to something. Actually, I read about there's this priest who was a very good friend of Weil, that I think it was him that said that when you communicated, when you talked with Weil, you just had this sense of a person who were fully attentive to everything you said and did in that communication. So she was, in that respect, she was walking the walk as well as talking the talk.
Mhm.
it goes to the question of, what is education for? That reminds me of how now being in academia, it seems to become more and more about filling seats than anything else, more of a neoliberal model of education where, just fill as many seats as possible, make as much money as possible. And I hear, because I'm, was not alive at this time, that, between, I don't know, maybe the 50s and the 90s, there was more of a sense that higher education, and at least in the United States, was meant, also had much more of a moral value in the sense of educating liberal individuals, not liberal in like the left or the right sense, but in the sense of free individuals that are capable, that are responsible with their own freedom, and are educated in a way to participate responsibly in the political process as well. Right? That's the ideal of the liberal education, as I understand it. And that seems to be becoming more and more degraded in favor of an instrumental approach to education. Like, oh, I got my degree, now I can just go and get my job and, do my own thing. And so my worry with that going away from more socially responsible forms of education and sliding in standards of education is just going more and more into developing a society of going back to Plato, where if education just becomes another means to an end to get what I want and rise up the social ladder, it's just developing more tyrannical personalities, maybe in the sense of, even my education is just about what it can do for me, what I can get or consume out of it. Um, yeah.
Yeah. There may be, I mean, in my opinion, there's nothing more dehumanizing, or all forms of dehumanization stem ultimately from that attitude towards education. Because if the soul is a process of formation itself, then education, it can't be a means to something else. Paideia or Bildung, you know, uh, is education is the essence of human existence. It's how we become more fully human. And I don't think that there is um, a final limit to that becoming. And so learning as a lifelong pursuit, I think, has to be the basis of any just society. And the meaning of human life as such, I think, is education in the highest sense. And so I think it's quite um, a diagnosis that you've made, Pedro, in the way that education gets instrumentalized in our time as just a means to the end of getting a well-paying job. I mean, even if it would be better if education was understood as a means of creating a well-informed citizen who could participate in self-governance. I mean, but even that would be to still be instrumentalizing education to some degree, but it would be instrumentalizing it towards a higher value than just the economic one. I think we need even to reach higher than that, in fact, to something infinite, like the good. Like we'll never be done trying to become adequate to that transcendent good that Plato um, is trying to direct our attention towards. So I don't know, it definitely feels like it comes down to paideia
Yeah.
education in the end.
I think one of the most common questions I get as a math teacher is what is it good for? And it's the one question that I don't want them to ask. So I see it, a lot of my task is simply somehow to make them stop asking that question, because if I try to answer it, it never helps. They don't get any more motivated. And actually, I think that where I stir most motivation in my students is actually when I start talking about some of the paradoxes surrounding the concept of infinity, things like Hilbert's hotel or Cantor's analysis of transfinite numbers and things like that. They very often find that very stimulating. Or if I talk about the fact that they cannot see a triangle because of the way it's defined, it's not perceivable. They can think it, but they cannot see it. So when I put these kind of, say, paradoxes in front of them, I can feel they are stimulated, and they are much more than if I try to explain them what math is good for.
Hmm.
Quite the
Right.
different approach to say, like, you come into the class, math should teach me how to solve these problems. But, Vei's approach would be like, well, how can math deepen your participation in reality and appreciate the beauty in reality that's there? That's ultimately, participation in the good, right? Those are very different ways of teaching math.
For sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, she says there's no evidence for this transcendent good, and yet I think Plato, the Pythagoreans, and maybe she gets into this elsewhere and nuances that statement, but math and mathesis or learning in general, I think um, the intuition that there is a truth that is beyond anything that we can sense that comes through, particularly the study of mathematics, does seem to me to be at least the closest we might have uh, as the closest thing we might have to kind of evidence for a transcendent good, right? So it's what is it good for? It's good for cultivating the sort of attention that would allow us to that would lead us to the good. You know,
That's how May sees it as well.
yeah.
So she has a large piece called Concerning the Pythagorean Doctrine, where she goes into an analysis of math and the what's it for, and it's exactly what you're saying. It's leading us towards the good,
Hmm.
to to realize the good, the absolute goodness.
I think Spinoza says something along those lines when he says that the person who really desires and works towards understanding nature and the universe and network of relations that is nature really loves God, is the way he put it. I really like that line too.
And I know you have to leave soon, Pedro. So I just want to say, I think a conversation like this is also very stimulating in terms of approaching the divine realm of
Yeah,
absolute goodness.
I get like a sense of peace wash over me at the end of these sorts of conversations that I know is kind of it's like little nudges in the right direction.
Yeah. No, it's an analogy occurs to me that, Karsten, you're A squared. Maybe I'm B squared, and Pedro, you're C squared, and together our angles create a triangle.
Yeah. I really wish I didn't have to go. I could keep going if you guys want to continue the conversation, keep this going. I'd love to.
Yeah, I don't have a flight to catch, but I have some grocery shopping to do, and they deliver bread at the local grocery store pretty soon. And if I don't get there, it'll be gone. So gotta get my human needs met. But no, this was a really enriching
I,
conversation.
I don't have as much conversations as you guys, so I'll probably contact you again with some
Please
kind
do,
of
Karsten.
proposal.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to brainstorm, see where we can take this discussion.
Sounds good. I look forward to that. Hope you both have a Merry Christmas,
Same to
nice New
you.
Year. Talk to you
Yeah,
soon.
y'all
Yeah.
too. Have a good end of your year.
Thanks. Safe travels, Pedro.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Safe travels, Pedro.
Thank you,
Bye.
Karsten. Bye, y'all. Thank you for the discussion.
See you.